At the inheritance meeting of my late daughter, my son-in-law stood against me, slapped me, and shouted, "You won't see a single cent of this money, you absent old man." He thought I didn't notice when he put something in my glass. I simply switched the glasses discreetly. Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this and comment the city you're watching from. I never expected that the worst day of my life would get even worse, but that's exactly what happened in that sterile conference room at Miller & Associates law firm. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in a harsh, unforgiving glow that seemed to match the mood perfectly. Aurora had been gone for 3 months. 3 months since my daughter's funeral, 3 months of sleepless nights, wondering if I could have done something different. And now, here we were, dividing up what remained of her life like vultures picking at bones. I sat at the far end of the mahogany table, my hands folded tightly in my lap to stop them from shaking. George, my son-in-law, occupied the chair at the head of the table as if he owned the place. His perfectly pressed suit and slicked-back hair made him look like he was attending a business meeting rather than settling his dead wife's affairs. The lawyer, Mr. Miller, shuffled through papers with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before. "Now, regarding the house on Maple Street," Miller began, his voice monotone and professional. "The property was jointly owned, so it passes automatically to the surviving spouse." George nodded, his expression smug. I bit my tongue, remembering how Aurora had called me just 6 months before she died, crying about how George was pressuring her to put his name on the deed. "It's just a formality, Dad," she'd said through her tears. "He says married couples should share everything." I should have insisted she come stay with me then. I should have asked more questions. But I'd learned long ago not to interfere too much in my daughter's marriage. The few times I'd tried, it had only pushed her further away. "The savings account, approximately $47,000, also passes to Mr. Hartwell," Miller continued. My jaw clenched. I knew Aurora had been saving that money for years, putting away every penny she could from her part-time job at the library. She'd mentioned wanting to take some art classes, maybe travel a little, dreams she'd never get to fulfill now. And the life insurance policy, valued at $200,000, with Mr. Hartwell listed as the sole beneficiary. The numbers felt like punches to my gut. Not because I wanted the money, I'd never expected Aurora to leave me anything, but because each asset represented a piece of my daughter's life that was being handed over to a man who had barely shed a tear at her funeral. George cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention. "Actually, there's something else we need to discuss." His pale blue eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "Jacob, I think it's important that everyone understands the situation here." The way he said my name, like it tasted bitter in his mouth, sent a chill down my spine. I straightened in my chair, meeting his gaze. What situation? The situation where Aurora's father thinks he deserves some sort of inheritance from a daughter he barely knew. George's voice was calm, conversational even, but there was venom underneath. "I mean, let's be honest here. When was the last time you actually spent quality time with Aurora? When was the last time you were there for her when she needed you?" Heat rose in my cheeks. The lawyer looked uncomfortable, shuffling his papers and avoiding eye contact. I wanted to defend myself, to explain that I'd tried to be there, that Aurora had often seemed distant and reluctant to spend time together in recent years. But something in George's expression warned me that this was just the beginning. "I loved my daughter," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. George laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the conference room walls. "Love? You call abandoning your family love? You call working 60-hour weeks and missing every important moment in Aurora's life love?" I felt my hands clench into fists under the table. Yes, I'd worked long hours. Yes, I'd missed some school plays and parent-teacher conferences, but I'd been trying to provide for Aurora after her mother left us when she was 12. I'd been a single father doing the best I could with limited resources and no support system. But George wasn't finished. He stood up slowly, his 6-foot frame towering over me as I remained seated. His face had transformed from smugly satisfied to genuinely angry, and I realized this wasn't just about money or inheritance. This was personal. You want to know what Aurora used to tell me about you? George's voice dropped to a whisper, but in the silence of the room, every word was crystal clear. She used to cry about how you never really listened to her, never cared about what she wanted. Do you know she stopped calling you Dad when she was 16? She called you Jacob, because that's how distant you'd become. The words hit me like physical blows. I remembered Aurora switching to using my first name, but I'd thought it was just teenage rebellion, something she'd grow out of. I'd never realized it was a sign of how deeply I'd failed her. George began pacing around the table, circling me like a predator. She told me about the time you missed her high school graduation because of work. She told me about how you forgot her birthday 3 years running. She told me about how she had to learn to drive from her friend's father because you were always too busy. Each accusation was true, and each one carved a little deeper into my soul. I'd been working construction then, taking every overtime shift I could get to keep us afloat financially. Aurora had needed clothes, school supplies, college savings. I thought I was being a good father by providing for her material needs, but I'd neglected the emotional ones. And you know what the saddest part is? George stopped directly in front of me, his voice rising with each word. Even after all that neglect, even after years of putting work before family, you still think you deserve something from her estate. You think being related by blood gives you some claim to what she worked for. I opened my mouth to respond, to try to explain that I wasn't there for money, that I just wanted some small memento of my daughter. But George's hand moved faster than I could react. The slap echoed through the conference room like a gunshot. My head snapped to the side, my cheek burning from the impact. The lawyer gasped, half rising from his chair, but George held up a hand to stop him. "You don't get to speak," George snarled, his face red with fury. "You don't get to justify 30 years of failure as a father. You don't get to waltz in here and pretend you cared about Aurora when she spent most of her adult life trying to fill the void you left in her heart." My cheek throbbed, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the emotional devastation. Because underneath all the anger and accusations, I could hear the truth. I had failed Aurora. I had been absent when she needed me most. I had prioritized work over family, financial security, over emotional connection. George leaned down, his face inches from mine. "You're not getting a single penny from this estate, you pathetic old man. Aurora didn't want you in her life, and she sure as hell wouldn't want you benefiting from her death." He straightened up and smoothed his suit jacket, suddenly composed again. "Mr. Miller, I think we can conclude this meeting. As the sole beneficiary and executor of Aurora's estate, I have everything I need." "Usa," the lawyer nodded quickly, clearly eager to end the uncomfortable scene. He began gathering his papers while George walked back to his chair, picking up a glass of water that had been sitting untouched throughout the meeting. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. As George reached for his glass, I saw him glance at mine, the identical glass of water that had been placed in front of me when I arrived. There was something calculating in that glance, something that didn't match his emotional outburst from moments before. I watched as George's fingers drummed nervously on the table beside my glass. During his tirade, when everyone's attention had been focused on his dramatic performance, had he done something to my drink? The thought seemed paranoid, but George's entire demeanor had shifted too quickly from genuine rage to controlled satisfaction. And there was something about the way he kept glancing between the glasses that set off every alarm bell in my head. Without making it obvious, I reached for what I thought was my glass, but at the last second, I shifted and picked up the one that had been sitting in front of George instead. If I was wrong, no harm done. If I was right. George's eyes widened almost imperceptibly as I brought his glass to my lips and took a long drink. The water tasted normal, nothing unusual. But George's face had gone pale, and I saw his Adam's apple bob as he swallowed hard. "Well," George said, his voice slightly strained, "I think we're finished here." He reached for what was now my original glass and drank deeply, as if trying to prove that everything was normal. But as I watched him, I noticed the slight tremor in his hands, the way his breathing had become shallow. And when he set the glass down, I saw something that chilled me to the bone, relief mixed with growing panic, as if he'd just realized he'd made a terrible mistake. Whatever George had put in that drink, he'd just consumed it himself. 20 minutes after leaving the law office, George excused himself to the bathroom for the third time. His face had taken on a grayish pallor, and beads of sweat dotted his forehead, despite the air conditioning. Whatever he'd intended for me was now coursing through his own system, and from the looks of it, it wasn't pleasant. "Food poisoning," he muttered when he returned to the reception area where I was pretending to read outdated magazines. "Must have been something I ate for lunch." I nodded sympathetically, though inside I felt a grim satisfaction. "You should probably head home and rest," I suggested. "Get some fluids in you." George glared at me, suspicion flickering in his increasingly unfocused eyes. But another wave of nausea hit him, and he doubled over slightly, pressing a hand to his stomach. "Yeah, maybe you're right," he said through gritted teeth. "But Jacob, don't think this changes anything. Don't think you can come sniffing around Aurora's things while I'm feeling under the weather." "Wouldn't dream of it," I lied smoothly. I waited in my car until George's silver Mercedes pulled out of the parking lot, weaving slightly as it turned onto the main road. Only then did I start my engine and head toward the house where Aurora had spent the last 5 years of her life. The house that now belonged entirely to the man who had just tried to drug me. The Victorian-style home sat on a quiet street, lined with oak trees, their branches creating a canopy that filtered the late afternoon sunlight into dancing patterns on the sidewalk. Aurora had fallen in love with this house the moment she saw it, calling me excitedly to describe the wraparound porch and the turret room she planned to use as an art studio. I'd never been inside. In all the years Aurora had lived here with George, he'd never invited me over, and Aurora had always suggested meeting at restaurants or neutral locations when we got together. At the time, I'd assumed she was just protecting George's privacy, but now I wondered if there had been other reasons. The spare key was exactly where Aurora had always kept it, under the third flower pot, on the left side of the porch steps. Some habits never change, even in marriage. I let myself in quietly, my heart pounding with a mixture of guilt and determination. The house felt hollow without Aurora's presence. George had already removed most of her personal items, leaving behind only the furniture and generic decorative pieces. Family photos had been taken down, leaving pale rectangles on the wall where they once hung. It was as if he was systematically erasing every trace of her from their shared space. I climbed the stairs to the second floor, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpeting. Aurora's art studio had been in the turret room at the end of the hall. If she'd hidden anything personal, anything that might explain the growing unease I'd felt about her marriage in her final months, it would be there. The studio door was locked, which struck me as odd. Why lock a room in your own house unless you have something to hide? I tried several of Aurora's favorite numbers, her birthday, our old address, the date she graduated high school. Nothing worked. Then I remembered something from her childhood. When Aurora was about 10, she'd gone through a phase of creating secret codes and hiding places throughout our small apartment. Her favorite number combination had been the date we adopted our cat, Whiskers, 0847, for August 4th, 1997. The lock clicked open. Aurora's art studio was exactly as I'd imagined it would be. Easels positioned to catch the natural light from the turret windows, canvases in various stages of completion leaning against the walls, and the familiar smell of oil paints and turpentine that had followed her since high school art class. But it was what I found hidden behind a large landscape painting that made my heart skip a beat. A small wooden box, the kind Aurora used to keep her childhood treasures in, was tucked into a nook between the wall and an old bookshelf. Inside the box, beneath layers of sketches and art supply receipts, was a leather-bound journal with Aurora's initials embossed on the cover in faded gold letters. I sank into the chair at Aurora's easel and opened the journal with trembling hands. The entries were dated, starting about 2 years ago. Aurora's familiar handwriting filled the pages, the same careful script she'd used for thank you notes and grocery lists. But these words carried a weight that made my chest tighten. The first few entries were mundane. Complaints about work, excitement about a new painting technique, worries about our strained relationship. But as I read deeper, a darker picture began to emerge. March 15th, George went through my phone again today. He said he was just checking the time, but I saw him scrolling through my messages. When I asked him about it, he got that look on his face, the one where his eyes go completely cold. He said I was being paranoid, that married couples shouldn't have secrets from each other. March 22nd. I tried to call Dad today, but George said it would upset him to hear from me out of the blue. He reminded me about how hurt Dad looked at Christmas when I couldn't visit because of work. Maybe George is right. Maybe it's better to keep my distance until I figure out how to bridge that gap. My hands shook as I read those words. Aurora had wanted to call me, but George had convinced her not to. How many times had she reached for the phone, only to be talked out of it by a man who understood exactly which emotional buttons to push? The entries continued, each one revealing another layer of manipulation and control. April 3rd. George says I spend too much money on art supplies. He's right. I probably do get carried away sometimes. He's taken over managing our finances completely now, which is actually a relief. I was never good with money anyway. At least this way, I don't have to worry about making mistakes. April 18th. Had lunch with Sarah from the library today. When I got home, George asked me all sorts of questions about what we talked about, who else was there, whether any men had approached our table. He said he was just concerned about my safety, that downtown can be dangerous for women alone. I guess he has a point. Maybe I should stick to lunch dates closer to home. May the 2nd. George suggested I quit my job at the library. He says his income is enough to support us both, and it would give me more time to focus on my art. Part of me is excited about having more time to paint, but another part feels nervous about being financially dependent on him. Is that normal? I feel like I can't trust my own instincts anymore. Page after page chronicled the systematic erosion of Aurora's independence. George had isolated her from friends and family, controlled her finances, and convinced her that her own judgment couldn't be trusted. And through it all, he'd presented himself as the caring husband, looking out for her best interests. But it was the entries from the final few months that made my blood run cold. September 14th. George has been asking questions about Dad's health, about whether he has any life insurance or retirement savings. I don't understand why it matters to him. When I asked, he said he was just worried about my future, about what would happen to me if something happened to Dad. But the way he talks about it makes my skin crawl. October 1st. Found some papers in George's office that I don't understand. They looked like insurance forms, but they had Dad's name on them and information I never gave George. When I confronted him about it, he said he was just researching options for Dad's care as he gets older. He made it sound thoughtful and responsible, but something feels wrong. October 15th. George has been pushing me to reconcile with Dad, but only on his terms. He wants to schedule the meetings, choose the locations, even sit in on our conversations to help facilitate healing. I love that he wants to help, but Dad and I have such a complicated history. I'm not sure George understands the nuances. The final entry was dated just 2 weeks before Aurora's death. November 8th. I found more papers today. This time I recognized them. They're copies of Dad's financial records, bank statements, even what looks like a will from years ago. I don't know how George got these documents, and when I asked him, he got angry. Really angry, in a way I've never seen before. He said I was violating his privacy by going through his office, that a wife should trust her husband. But how can I trust him when he's clearly been investigating my father behind both our backs? What is he planning? The journal fell from my numb hands as the implications hit me like a physical blow. George hadn't just been isolating Aurora from me. He'd been gathering information about my finances, my assets, everything he'd need to know to what? What had he been planning? And Aurora had discovered his deception. She'd confronted him about it just 2 weeks before her sudden death from what the doctors had called a brain aneurysm. A rare but not unheard of condition for a woman her age, they'd said. Stress could be a contributing factor, they'd mentioned. Had George's controlling behavior and her discovery of his secret investigations created enough psychological pressure to trigger a medical crisis? Or was there something more sinister at play? I picked up the journal again, my hands shaking as I flipped through the pages, looking for any clue I might have missed. That's when I noticed something that made my heart race. Several pages had been torn out. The journal entries jumped from November 8th directly to some earlier March entries, with obvious gaps where pages had been removed. Whatever Aurora had written in those final 2 weeks, whatever she had discovered about George's true intentions, had been destroyed. But by who? Aurora herself, or someone who had access to this room after her death? A sound from downstairs made me freeze, the distinctive creak of the front door opening. George's voice drifted up the stairs, weak but determined. "I know you're in here, Jacob. We need to talk." My heart hammered against my ribs. George was supposed to be homesick, incapacitated by whatever substance he'd intended for me, but here he was, and I was trapped in his house with evidence of his manipulation and possible worse crimes. I quickly slipped the journal into my jacket pocket and looked around the studio for another way out. The turret windows were too high for a safe jump, and the only exit was back down the hallway where George was undoubtedly waiting. "Jacob!" George called again, his voice closer now. "I saw your car outside. Don't make this harder than it has to be." I had no choice but to face him. But as I opened the studio door and stepped into the hallway, I realized I now held something George didn't know I possessed. The truth about what Aurora had discovered, and the knowledge that her death might not have been the random medical event everyone believed it to be. George stood at the bottom of the stairs, gripping the banister with white knuckles. His face was pale and drawn, with dark circles under his eyes that hadn't been there this morning. Whatever he'd put in that drink was still working its way through his system, but his determination to confront me seemed to override his physical discomfort. Breaking and entering Jacob, his voice was hoarse, but the underlying menace was unmistakable. "Aurora always said you had boundary issues." I descended the stairs slowly, keeping my expression neutral, despite the journal burning like evidence against my ribs. The door was unlocked. I just wanted to see her art studio one last time. George's bloodshot eyes narrowed. "Nothing in this house belongs to you. Not anymore, not ever." He swayed slightly, catching himself against the wall. "You need to leave, now." "You don't look well, George. Maybe you should sit down." His laugh was bitter and harsh. "Don't pretend to care about my health. We both know what happened at that meeting today." His gaze bored into mine, searching for some sign of guilt or acknowledgement. I tilted my head, feigning confusion. "What are you talking about? You said you had food poisoning." For a moment, George seemed genuinely uncertain. The disorientation from whatever substance he'd consumed was clearly affecting his judgment, making him second-guess what he remembered about our encounter at the law office. He pressed his palm against his forehead, wincing. "I need you to leave, Jacob. Before I do something we'll both regret." "Is that a threat?" George's eyes flashed with anger, but before he could respond, another wave of nausea hit him. He doubled over, retching violently into his hands. When he straightened up, there was fear mixed with the fury in his expression. "What did you do to me?" he whispered. I could have told him the truth, that he'd poisoned himself with whatever concoction he'd prepared for me. Instead, I chose a different approach. "George, I think you need medical attention. You're clearly very ill. I'm not going anywhere until you tell me what you did." The irony was almost poetic. George was experiencing firsthand the effects of his own malicious intent, and his paranoia was preventing him from seeking the help he desperately needed. But as I watched him struggle to stay upright, I realized this might be my only chance to get the information I needed. "George, I want to ask you something about Aurora's final weeks. She seemed troubled when I last saw her." His expression shifted, becoming more guarded. "Aurora was fine. She was happy." "Was she?" Because the few times we talked on the phone, she sounded stressed, worried about something. George's jaw clenched. "Aurora had anxiety issues. She always overthought everything, saw problems where none existed. I was helping her work through those tendencies." The casual way he dismissed Aurora's concerns as mental health issues made my skin crawl. This was classic gaslighting, convincing the victim that their instincts and observations couldn't be trusted. What kind of anxiety issues? I pressed. She was paranoid about money, about our relationship, about you. George leaned against the wall, still fighting off waves of nausea. She convinced herself that I was trying to control her, which was ridiculous. Everything I did was to protect her. Protect her from what? George's eyes became distant, unfocused. Whether from the drugs in his system or from slipping into a familiar narrative, he seemed to be speaking more freely than he normally would. From making the same mistakes you did. Aurora had your gene for poor judgment, Jacob. She would have destroyed herself financially if I hadn't taken over our accounts. She would have isolated herself from everyone who cared about her if I hadn't helped her maintain those relationships. My hands clenched into fists. Helped her maintain relationships? You mean like the relationship with me that you systematically destroyed? George's laugh was weak but cruel. I didn't destroy anything that wasn't already broken. Aurora came to me damaged thanks to your years of neglect. I spent 5 years trying to fix what you broke. And how exactly did you fix it? Something flickered in George's eyes, a moment of clarity that seemed to cut through his drug-induced haze. He straightened up slightly, suddenly more alert. Why are you really here, Jacob? What are you looking for? I realized I'd pushed too hard, too fast. George might be impaired, but he wasn't stupid. I told you I wanted to see Aurora's studio. Bullshit. George pushed himself away from the wall, swaying but determined. You're fishing for something. Did someone put you up to this? Did Aurora tell you something before she died? The desperation in his voice told me everything I needed to know. George was terrified that Aurora had confided in me, had shared whatever secrets she'd discovered in those final weeks. He didn't know about the journal, but he suspected Aurora had been planning to expose him. What would Aurora have told me, George? What were you so afraid she'd discover? George's face went from pale to completely white. Get out. Get out of my house right now or I'm calling the police. Maybe you should call them, I said calmly. Maybe they'd be interested to know about Aurora's suspicions in the weeks before she died. Aurora didn't have suspicions. She had delusions brought on by stress and her family history of mental illness. Family history? What family history? George realized he'd said too much. His mouth snapped shut, and he glared at me with the hatred of a cornered animal. There's no family history of mental illness in Aurora's family, I continued. I think you know that. I think you were counting on everyone believing that her fears about you were just paranoia. You don't know what you're talking about, don't I? Then why don't you explain to me how you got copies of my financial records? Aurora found them, didn't she? That's what she was really upset about in those final weeks. George's composure cracked completely. She was supposed to trust me. I was her husband. Everything I did was to secure our future, to make sure she'd be taken care of if something happened to you. By investigating me behind our backs, by lying to her about your motivations. I wasn't lying. George's voice rose to a shout, then immediately dropped as another wave of sickness hit him. I was protecting her from the truth about what kind of father you really were. Do you know what it did to her, watching you ignore her calls, seeing you choose work over family again and again? So you made sure she'd stop calling altogether. I helped her see that she deserved better than scraps of attention from a man who never really wanted to be a father in the first place. The words hit me like physical blows, but I forced myself to stay focused. George was revealing more than he realized, confirming everything I'd read in Aurora's journal. And what about the insurance papers she found? What about the will you somehow got your hands on? George went very still. I don't know what you're talking about. Yes, you do. Aurora confronted you about it. She knew you were planning something involving my assets, my estate. What was it, George? Were you planning to have Aurora reconcile with me just long enough to ensure she'd inherit everything when I died? That's insane. Is it? Or were you planning something more immediate? Aurora discovered your research into my finances, your copies of legal documents you had no right to possess. She realized you weren't the caring son-in-law looking out for her future. You were a predator positioning yourself to benefit from my death. George's breathing became rapid and shallow. You're crazy. Just like Aurora was crazy in those final weeks. The stress made her paranoid, made her see conspiracies everywhere. What stress, George? What was stressing her out so much that it might have triggered a brain aneurysm? The question hung in the air between us like a loaded weapon. George's face cycled through several expressions: fear, anger, calculation, and finally a cold resolution that made my blood run cold. Aurora died of a medical condition, he said slowly, his voice regaining some of its earlier menace despite his physical weakness. A rare but natural occurrence that can happen to anyone at any time. The doctors confirmed it. The autopsy confirmed it. There was nothing suspicious about her death. Nothing suspicious except the timing. 2 weeks after she discovered your secret investigation into my finances. 2 weeks after she confronted you about violating her privacy and mine. George straightened up as much as his condition would allow. Careful, Jacob. You're starting to sound paranoid yourself. First, you break into my house. Now you're accusing me of what exactly? Murder? The word hung between us like a blade. Neither of us had said it directly until now, but it had been lurking beneath every accusation and denial. I'm just wondering about the coincidence, I said carefully. Aurora discovers something that upsets her enough to write about it in her private thoughts, confronts you about it, and then dies suddenly from a stress-related medical condition. Coincidences happen, Jacob, and even if Aurora's discovery of some financial documents caused her stress, that would make you partially responsible for her death, wouldn't it? If you'd been a better father, if she'd trusted you enough to come to you with her concerns instead of keeping them bottled up inside, maybe she'd still be alive. The accusation hit its mark, and George knew it. He could see the guilt and self-doubt flickering across my face, and despite his weakened state, he pressed his advantage. That's what really bothers you, isn't it? Not some conspiracy theory about me, but the knowledge that Aurora died alone with her worries because she couldn't trust her own father enough to reach out for help. I felt the journal's weight against my ribs and drew strength from it. Aurora had tried to reach out to me multiple times. George had systematically prevented it, isolating her from anyone who might have helped her see through his manipulation. You're right about one thing, I said quietly. Aurora did die alone with her worries, but not because she couldn't trust me. Because you made sure she couldn't trust herself. George's expression shifted again, becoming calculating. Prove it. The challenge was simple and devastating. Whatever evidence Aurora had gathered, whatever she had discovered about George's true intentions, it had died with her. All I had was circumstantial evidence and a growing certainty that my daughter's death was no accident. But as I looked at George's pale, sick face, I realized something important. He might have destroyed Aurora's evidence, but he couldn't destroy his own guilt. And that guilt, combined with whatever was still working through his system, might be enough to get him to reveal the truth himself. The silence stretched between us like a taut wire, ready to snap at the slightest pressure. George swayed against the wall, his face growing paler by the minute, but his eyes remained sharp with cunning despite his physical distress. I realized he was waiting for me to make the next move, to reveal how much I actually knew versus how much I was guessing. But I had Aurora's journal burning against my chest, and more importantly, I had something George didn't know I possessed. Patience learned from 30 years of construction work where rushing could get you killed. You know what strikes me as odd, I said conversationally, as if we were discussing the weather instead of my daughter's suspicious death. Aurora's art studio was locked. Why would someone lock a room in their own house? George's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Artists are protective of their workspaces. Aurora always locked that room. Funny thing about that, Aurora never locked any room when she was growing up, never even locked her bedroom door during her teenage years. She said locked doors made her feel claustrophobic. I paused, watching George's reaction, almost like someone who grew up in a house where privacy wasn't respected might feel. People change, Jacob. Marriage teaches you the value of personal space. Or maybe someone taught her that she needed to hide things from her husband. George pushed himself away from the wall, anger overriding his physical weakness. What exactly are you implying? I'm not implying anything. I'm stating facts. Aurora locked her studio. Aurora was researching ways to protect her personal assets in the months before she died. Aurora was scared enough of something to start keeping secrets. You don't know any of that. Don't I? I reached into my jacket slowly, watching George's eyes widen as he anticipated what I might pull out. Instead of the journal, I withdrew my phone. You know, George, I've been thinking about calling Detective Morrison. George went very still. Who? The detective who handled Aurora's case. Lovely woman, very thorough. She mentioned that if any new information came to light about Aurora's state of mind in those final weeks, they could reopen the investigation. It was a complete bluff. I hadn't spoken to any detective, and I wasn't even sure Aurora's death had been investigated beyond the standard autopsy. But the effect on George was immediate and dramatic. His face went from pale to gray, and he gripped the wall so tightly his knuckles turned white. There's nothing to investigate. Aurora died of natural causes. Natural causes triggered by extreme stress. The question is, what was causing that stress? George's breathing became shallow and rapid. Whether from the substance still affecting his system or from panic, he was clearly struggling to maintain control. You're fishing, Jacob. You have nothing. Maybe, or maybe I have more than you think. I held up my phone. Should I call Detective Morrison now, or would you prefer to explain things yourself? Explain what things? Why you were researching my financial situation without my knowledge or consent. Why you had copies of legal documents that should have been private. Why Aurora was so upset about your behavior that she... I let the sentence hang unfinished. George's face crumpled, and for a moment he looked like he might collapse entirely. Then something shifted in his expression, a hardening as if he was making a decision. You want to know the truth, Jacob? Fine. I'll tell you the truth. He staggered to the living room couch and sank into it heavily. I followed, keeping my distance, but positioning myself between him and the front door. Aurora was weak, George said, his voice barely above a whisper. She had your weakness, your inability to make hard decisions. She would have destroyed herself if I hadn't stepped in. I had stepped in how? By taking control, by making the choices she was too scared to make herself. George looked up at me, and I saw something chilling in his eyes. Not guilt or remorse, but resentment. Do you have any idea how exhausting it is to be married to someone who can't handle adult responsibilities? Aurora was perfectly capable of handling her own responsibilities. Was she? She couldn't even maintain a relationship with her own father without my help. She was so damaged by your neglect that she couldn't trust her own judgment about anything. The casual cruelty in his voice made my stomach turn. This wasn't a man mourning his wife. This was someone who had viewed Aurora as a project to be managed. So you managed her right into isolation. I protected her from people who would have taken advantage of her vulnerability. George's eyes blazed with self-righteous anger, including you, by researching my finances, by gathering information about my assets. George was quiet for a long moment, his head falling back against the couch cushions. When he spoke again, his voice was different, more detached, as if he was recounting someone else's story. Aurora was going to inherit everything you had eventually. It made sense to understand what that inheritance would involve, to plan for how to manage those assets responsibly. Responsibly meaning under your control. Someone had to think about the future. Aurora certainly wasn't capable of it. I felt the journal's weight again and drew strength from knowing Aurora's true thoughts about her marriage. Aurora was more capable than you gave her credit for, capable enough to discover what you were doing and confront you about it. George's eyes snapped to mine, suddenly alert despite his condition. So what did she tell you? Why don't you tell me what she discovered? What made her so upset in those final weeks? Aurora had anxiety attacks. She overthought everything, saw conspiracies where none existed. What specific conspiracies did she think she saw? George was quiet again, but I could see his mind working behind his bloodshot eyes. He was trying to figure out how much I knew, how much Aurora might have shared with me before her death. He thought. He stopped, shaking his head. It doesn't matter what she thought. She was wrong. Try me. George studied my face for a long moment, then seemed to come to a decision. Aurora thought I was planning to hurt you. The admission hung in the air between us like a loaded gun. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I kept my expression neutral. Hurt me how? She found some research I'd done about accidental deaths, about how to make something look natural. She completely misunderstood what it was for. My blood ran cold. What was it for? George's smile was weak but chilling. Insurance purposes. I was researching how insurance companies investigate claims, what they look for when determining whether a death was accidental or intentional. I wanted to make sure Aurora's policies were structured correctly. Aurora's policies? The life insurance policy that named me as beneficiary. I wanted to understand the claims process, the potential complications. George's voice was gaining strength, as if telling this story was somehow therapeutic for him. But Aurora saw the research and jumped to the wrong conclusion. Which was? She thought I was planning to kill you and make it look like an accident so she could inherit your estate. The words were spoken so casually, so matter-of-factly, that it took a moment for their full meaning to sink in. George wasn't denying the plan. He was claiming Aurora had misunderstood his motivation. And what was your actual motivation? George's eyes grew distant again. Aurora was fragile, Jacob. The stress of maintaining a relationship with you was killing her. Every phone call left her anxious for days. Every missed holiday or birthday sent her into a depression that lasted weeks. So you decided the solution was to eliminate me from her life permanently. I decided the solution was to eliminate the source of her pain. George's voice was eerily calm now, as if the drugs in his system had stripped away his ability to recognize how his words sounded. Aurora couldn't cut ties with you herself. She was too sentimental, too guilty about the past. But if something happened to you naturally, accidentally, she could grieve and then move on and inherit my estate in the process. George shrugged. That would have been a beneficial side effect. Aurora deserved that inheritance after everything you put her through. I stared at him in horror, realizing I was listening to a confession of premeditated murder. George had actually been planning to kill me, and he was so arrogant, so confident in his manipulation of Aurora that he was telling me about it. But Aurora figured it out. George's expression darkened. Aurora found some notes I'd made about your routine, your habits. She saw the insurance research. She put 2 and 2 together and got 5. Or she got 4. And you convinced her she was wrong. I tried to explain that she was misunderstanding everything, but she wouldn't listen. She became hysterical. Started talking about going to the police, about warning you. George's voice took on a petulant tone, like a child complaining about being misunderstood. She threatened to leave me, Jacob. After everything I'd done for her, after all the ways I'd protected and cared for her, she was going to throw our marriage away over a misunderstanding. So you stopped her. The words slipped out before I could catch them back. George went very still, his eyes fixing on mine with laser focus. Stopped her how, Jacob? What exactly are you accusing me of? I realized I'd walked into a trap. George might be physically compromised, but his mind was still sharp enough to catch me making accusations I couldn't prove. If I pushed too hard now, he'd clam up completely. But then I remembered the missing pages from Aurora's journal, and I realized those torn-out entries might have contained evidence of exactly how George had stopped her. I'm not accusing you of anything, I said carefully. I'm just trying to understand Aurora's state of mind in those final weeks. Her stress levels must have been through the roof if she thought her own husband was planning murder. George relaxed slightly. They were. She was having panic attacks, wasn't sleeping, couldn't eat. I was genuinely worried about her health. Worried enough to suggest she see a doctor? I suggested many things: therapy, medication, a vacation to clear her head. But Aurora was convinced that the problem was our marriage, not her mental health. And then she died. And then she died, George agreed, his voice flat and emotionless. A tragic coincidence that resolved nothing and left me dealing with the aftermath of her paranoid accusations. I wanted to grab him by the throat and force him to admit what he'd done, but I knew that approach would only backfire. Instead, I decided to try a different tactic. George, you're clearly still very ill from whatever you ingested earlier. Maybe we should get you to a hospital. His eyes narrowed suspiciously. I'm fine. You don't look fine. You're pale, you're sweating, and you've been fighting nausea for hours. What did you put in that drink? The question caught him off guard. His mouth opened and closed several times, before he managed to speak. I don't know what you're talking about. Yes, you do. You put something in what you thought was my glass at the law office. Something that's now making you very sick because you ended up drinking it yourself. George's face went through several expressions: surprise, fear, calculation, and finally, a grudging admiration. You switched the glasses. I switched the glasses. Now, what was in it? George was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing his options. Finally, he seemed to deflate completely. Something to make you compliant, suggestible. I needed you to sign some papers, transfer some assets voluntarily. What papers? Nothing that would have hurt you long term. Just some financial arrangements that would have made things easier for everyone involved. I stared at him, amazed by his ability to rationalize attempted drugging as a reasonable business practice. Easier for you, you mean? Easier for everyone. You would have signed the papers feeling good about helping Aurora's memory, and I would have had the resources to properly honor her legacy. By stealing from her father, George's eyes flashed with anger. By claiming what should have been hers all along. Aurora deserved your estate, Jacob. She deserved everything you should have given her while she was alive. And there it was. George's twisted logic laid bare. In his mind, Aurora's death hadn't ended his plans. It had simply changed the timeline. He still intended to claim my assets, one way or another. The living room felt smaller now, as if the walls were closing in around George's confession. He sat slumped on the couch, his earlier bravado fading as the reality of what he'd revealed began to sink in. The substance he'd meant for me was clearly affecting his judgment, making him more talkative than he'd ever intended to be. I pulled Aurora's journal from my jacket, holding it where George could see it clearly. His eyes widened, and what little color remained in his face drained away completely. You know what this is, don't you? George's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Where did you get that? From Aurora's studio, the studio you kept locked? I opened the journal to a random page, pretending to read from it. She documented everything, George. Every conversation, every suspicion, every piece of evidence she found. Give me that. George tried to stand, but immediately sat back down, overwhelmed by dizziness. That's private property. Aurora's private property, which makes it mine now, since I'm her only surviving relative. I flipped through the pages slowly, watching George's growing panic. She wrote about finding your research, about confronting you. She wrote about how scared she was in those final weeks. Aurora was paranoid. She misunderstood everything. Did she? Because according to this, she understood perfectly. I found one of the actual entries and read aloud. George has been asking questions about Dad's health, about whether he has any life insurance or retirement savings. I don't understand why it matters to him. George flinched, as if I'd slapped him. She took that out of context. And this one, found some papers in George's office that I don't understand. They looked like insurance forms, but they had Dad's name on them, and information I never gave George. I was trying to help plan for your future care. Were you? Or were you gathering information for something else entirely? I turned more pages, even though I had already memorized most of the entries. Here's an interesting one. I don't know how George got these documents, and when I asked him, he got angry. Really angry in a way I've never seen before. George's breathing became labored. Aurora had anxiety issues. She overthought everything. She was overthinking, or she was finally seeing you clearly for the first time. I closed the journal and met his gaze directly. The question is, George, what happened to the pages she wrote in those final 2 weeks? Because someone tore them out. I don't know what you're talking about. Yes, you do. Aurora discovered something that scared her enough to document it carefully. Something that made her realize just how much danger she was in. And then those pages disappeared. George was shaking now, whether from the drugs or from fear, I couldn't tell. You're making this up. You're trying to manipulate me just like Aurora did. Aurora manipulated you? That's rich, coming from someone who controlled every aspect of her life for 5 years. I protected her. You isolated her. You made her financially dependent on you. You convinced her that her own instincts couldn't be trusted. And when she finally started to see through your manipulation, you silenced her permanently. That's not what happened. George's voice was barely a whisper now. Then, tell me what did happen. Tell me about Aurora's final 2 weeks. George stared at the journal in my hands, his expression cycling between fear and calculation. I could see him weighing his options, trying to figure out how much I actually knew versus how much I was guessing. The Aurora you're describing in that journal wasn't the real Aurora, he said finally. The real Aurora was fragile, damaged by years of your neglect. She needed someone strong to make decisions for her. So you made the ultimate decision for her. I never heard Aurora. The words exploded out of him with such force that he started coughing violently. When he recovered, his voice was hoarse but determined. Everything I did was to protect her from pain. Including killing her? George went completely still. I never said that. You didn't have to. Aurora figured it out, didn't she? She realized that your research into accidental deaths wasn't about insurance claims or future planning. It was about eliminating problems. Aurora was the problem, George whispered, so quietly I almost missed it. She was going to destroy everything. The admission hung between us like a blade. George seemed to realize what he'd said and tried to backtrack, but the damage was done. She was going to go to the police. She was going to tell them about my research, my plans for you. She was going to ruin everything over a misunderstanding. So you decided she was the problem that needed to be eliminated instead of me. George's eyes filled with tears, but they weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of self-pity, of someone who felt wronged by circumstances beyond his control. Aurora forced my hand. She wouldn't listen to reason, wouldn't accept that everything I did was for her own good. She was going to throw away our entire future over paranoid delusions. What did you do to her, George? He was quiet for so long I thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat and emotionless, as if he was recounting something that had happened to someone else. Aurora had been having headaches for weeks. Stress headaches, I told her. I gave her medication to help with the pain. My blood ran cold. What kind of medication? Something to help her relax, to clear her mind so she could think rationally about our situation. George looked up at me, and there was something almost pleading in his expression. I never meant for it to. I just wanted her to calm down, to stop being so paranoid. You gave her something that triggered the aneurysm. The doctor said stress could be a contributing factor. Aurora was under tremendous stress because of her paranoid delusions about me, about you. If she'd just trusted me, if she'd let me handle the situation with you quietly, none of this would have happened. The casual way he shifted blame onto Aurora, even while confessing to drugging her, made my stomach turn. So you killed her to prevent her from warning me about your plans to kill me. I medicated her to help with her anxiety. The fact that her condition was exacerbated by the medication was an unforeseeable medical complication. Unforeseeable unless you researched the effects beforehand. George's eyes widened as he realized he'd walked into another trap. I researched everything about Aurora's health. I was concerned about her, concerned enough to research how certain medications might interact with genetic predispositions to aneurysms. The silence that followed was deafening. George stared at me with growing horror, as if he was finally understanding the implications of what he'd done. You researched my family medical history too, didn't you? Not just my finances, but my health records, looking for weaknesses, vulnerabilities you could exploit. I wanted to understand Aurora's genetic risks. You wanted to understand how to kill her without leaving obvious evidence. George started crying then, but they were still tears of self-pity rather than genuine remorse. I loved Aurora. Everything I did was because I loved her. You loved controlling her. There's a difference. She was going to leave me, Jacob. After everything I'd done for her, all the ways I'd protected and cared for her, she was going to walk away over a misunderstanding. It wasn't a misunderstanding. Aurora saw exactly who you really were. George wiped his face with the back of his hand, smearing tears and snot across his cheeks. What are you going to do now? Call the police. Try to prove something that can't be proven. I'm going to make sure Aurora's story is told. Her real story, not the version you've been selling to everyone. With what evidence? A journal full of paranoid ramblings from a mentally unstable woman? With your confession. George's eyes snapped to mine, suddenly alert. What confession? I pulled my phone from my pocket and held it up, showing the recording app that had been running for the past hour. George's face went from pale to gray as he realized the implications. "You've been recording this?" "Every word. Your admission about researching my finances, your plans to kill me, your confession about medicating Aurora to prevent her from warning me. All of it." George lunged for the phone, but his drug-impaired coordination made the attempt clumsy and ineffective. I stepped back easily, keeping the device out of his reach. "You can't use that in court. I was coerced. I was under the influence of drugs." "Drugs you intended for me, which makes this poetic justice," I smiled coldly. "And you weren't coerced, George. You were proud of what you'd done. You thought you were clever, manipulating Aurora so thoroughly that even after her death, no one suspected the truth." George collapsed back onto the couch, his face buried in his hands. "What do you want from me?" "I want justice for Aurora. I want her real story to be known. I'll deny everything. I'll say you drugged me, forced me to say things that weren't true. You could try that. But we both know there's more evidence to be found if someone knows where to look. Medical records showing what was really in Aurora's system when she died. Financial records proving your unauthorized access to my personal information. Maybe even physical evidence from those missing journal pages." George looked up at me with naked hatred. "Aurora was weak. She couldn't handle the real world without someone to protect her from her own poor judgment. Aurora was strong enough to see through your manipulation, strong enough to confront you about your lies, strong enough to threaten everything you'd built on deception and control. And look where it got her. The words were meant to hurt, but instead they gave me clarity." George felt no remorse for Aurora's death because in his twisted worldview, she had brought it on herself by refusing to submit to his control. "You're right," I said quietly. "Aurora's strength did get her killed, but it also exposed you for what you really are, and now everyone else is going to see it too." George stared at me for a long moment, then started laughing. It was a broken sound, more hysteria than humor. "You think you've won something here, Jacob? You think this recording proves anything other than that you're as paranoid as Aurora was? I think this recording proves that my daughter died because she was brave enough to stand up to a predator. And I think it's going to ensure that predator never hurts anyone else." The laughter died in George's throat as the full implications of his situation finally sank in. He was trapped, exposed, and facing the consequences of years of manipulation and control. But as I watched him process his defeat, I realized something that chilled me to the bone. George wasn't just a manipulative husband who had lost control of his victim. He was someone who had planned and executed murder and who was already calculating his next move. 3 weeks later, I sat in Detective Morrison's office, watching as she reviewed the transcript of George's recorded confession for the 3rd time. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting the same harsh glow that had illuminated that terrible meeting at the law firm, but this time the light felt cleansing rather than oppressive. "This is quite remarkable, Mr. Hartwell," Detective Morrison said, looking up from the papers spread across her desk. "In 30 years of police work, I've rarely seen someone confess this thoroughly to premeditated murder." "He didn't think he was confessing," I replied, my voice steadier than it had been in months. "He was bragging." George was so convinced of his own cleverness that he wanted someone to appreciate how perfectly he'd manipulated Aurora. Detective Morrison nodded, making notes in the margins of the transcript. "The medical examiner is reopening Aurora's case. With this new information, they're looking specifically for traces of the medications George mentioned. If they find what we suspect, they'll find—" We didn't need to finish the sentence. We both knew that modern forensic techniques could detect substances that might have been missed in the original autopsy, especially when the pathologists hadn't known to look for them. "What about the financial investigation?" I asked. "That's proceeding as well. We've found evidence that George gained unauthorized access to your credit reports, banking information, and legal records going back several years. Identity theft, stalking, conspiracy to commit fraud, the charges are adding up." I leaned back in the uncomfortable plastic chair, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders that I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying. "And the recording will hold up in court?" "Your attorney seems confident it will." George wasn't in custody, wasn't being interrogated, and you weren't acting as an agent of law enforcement. Plus, the fact that he drugged himself with his own intended weapon, well, let's just say juries don't tend to be sympathetic to that kind of poetic justice. Detective Morrison closed the file and looked at me with something approaching admiration. Can I ask you something, Mr. Hartwell? What made you suspicious enough to switch those glasses? I thought about that moment in the conference room, the calculated look in George's eyes, the way his performance had felt just a little too practiced. George was trying too hard to make me feel guilty about my relationship with Aurora. Everything he said was designed to make me doubt myself, to make me feel like I deserved whatever he had planned. But there was something in his eyes that didn't match his words. Something cold and calculating that had nothing to do with grief or righteous anger. And you'd seen that look before? I nodded slowly. In my ex-wife, actually. The same cold assessment whenever she was planning something cruel. I learned to recognize it as a survival mechanism. Detective Morrison made another note. Well, whatever instinct warned you that day saved your life. George's plan for you was considerably more permanent than drugging and robbing. The thought still sent chills down my spine. If I hadn't switched those glasses, I would have been drugged, manipulated into signing away my assets, and then eliminated in some carefully planned accident. Aurora's death would have remained a tragic medical mystery, and George would have inherited everything while playing the grieving widower. Has he said anything since his arrest? He's requested a lawyer and isn't talking. But his attorney has already approached the prosecutor about a plea deal. Apparently, George is claiming diminished capacity due to the stress of his wife's recent death. I felt my jaw clench. He's still trying to manipulate the system. It won't work, not with the evidence we have, and not with that recording. George's confession is too detailed, too proud of his own cleverness to support any claim of diminished capacity. Detective Morrison stood up, signaling that our meeting was coming to an end. There's something else, Mr. Hartwell, something I thought you should know. She walked to a filing cabinet and withdrew a manila envelope. When we searched George's house, we found these hidden behind some books in his office. She handed me the envelope, and with trembling fingers, I opened it. Inside were the missing pages from Aurora's journal, the entries from her final 2 weeks, the ones George had torn out and hidden. My hands shook as I read Aurora's final thoughts, her growing fear and determination, documented in her careful handwriting. November 22nd. I found George's detailed notes about Dad's daily routine today. He knows what time Dad leaves for work, what route he takes, where he stops for coffee. This isn't casual interest, this is surveillance. I confronted him again, and this time he didn't even try to lie. He said Dad deserves what's coming to him for being such a terrible father. I'm scared of what George is planning. November 25th. George gave me pills today, said they were for my headaches, but I recognized the bottle from his research materials. I didn't take them. I've been pretending to take them, but I've been hiding them instead. I need to get to Dad, need to warn him, but George is watching me so carefully now. He knows I know. November 29th. This might be my last entry. George is insisting I take the medication, says my headaches are getting worse and I need stronger treatment. I tried to call Dad 3 times today, but George disconnected the calls each time. He says I'm being paranoid, but I know he's planning something terrible. If something happens to me, I need someone to know that it wasn't an accident. George is dangerous, and Dad is in danger too. I'm going to hide this journal where George won't think to look for it. Maybe someday someone will find it and understand what really happened. The final entry was dated the day before Aurora died. I closed my eyes, imagining my daughter's terror in those final hours, knowing her husband was planning to kill both of us and feeling powerless to stop him. She was so brave, I whispered. Detective Morrison nodded. She was, and because of her bravery and yours, George won't hurt anyone else. I carefully placed the pages back in the envelope. Can I keep these? They'll be needed as evidence, but once the trial is over, they'll be returned to you. I walked out of the police station into the crisp autumn afternoon, breathing deeply for what felt like the first time in months. The weight of uncertainty, of wondering whether I'd failed Aurora as completely as George had claimed, was finally lifting. Aurora hadn't died because I was a terrible father. She hadn't died because of stress or anxiety or genetic predisposition. She had died because she was strong enough to see through a predator's manipulation, brave enough to confront him, and determined enough to try to protect me, even when it put her own life at risk. My phone buzzed with a text message from my attorney. Plea negotiations have broken down. George's lawyer is advising him to go to trial. This could take a while, but we're confident in our case. I typed back, "Good. Aurora deserves her day in court." That evening, I sat in my small apartment surrounded by boxes of Aurora's belongings that George's arrest had finally given me access to. Her paintings, her art supplies, her books, all the pieces of her life that George had tried to erase were now back where they belonged. I found a canvas tucked between some others, one I'd never seen before. It was a painting of our old apartment, the one where Aurora had grown up. But it wasn't the cramped, worn space I remembered. In Aurora's painting, it was warm and bright, filled with the kind of love that transcends material circumstances. At the bottom, in Aurora's careful script, was a title, "Where I Learned That Love Means Never Giving Up." I felt tears sting my eyes as I realized what she'd been trying to tell me. Despite our complicated relationship, despite the years of distance and misunderstanding, Aurora had never stopped loving me. She had seen through George's attempts to poison her against me, had recognized his manipulation for what it was, and in the end, she had died trying to save me from the same predator who had destroyed her. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found Detective Morrison's number. When she answered, her voice was professional but kind. "Mr. Hartwell, is everything all right? I want to establish a scholarship," I said, "in Aurora's name, for young women in abusive relationships to help them get the education and resources they need to escape." There was a pause. "That's a wonderful way to honor her memory." Aurora spent her final weeks trying to protect me from George's plans. Now I want to spend whatever time I have left protecting other women from men like him. I think Aurora would be proud of that choice. After I hung up, I sat in the quiet of my apartment, surrounded by my daughter's artwork and feeling her presence more strongly than I had since her death. George had tried to erase Aurora's story, to rewrite her as a weak, damaged woman who couldn't survive without his control. But the truth was exactly the opposite. Aurora had been strong enough to see through his manipulation. She had been brave enough to confront a dangerous man when she realized what he was planning. She had been determined enough to document everything, to leave a trail of evidence that would eventually expose the truth. And she had been loving enough to die trying to save a father she felt she'd lost years ago. The trial would come, and George would face justice for what he'd done. But for me, the real victory had already been won. I finally understood who my daughter really was, not the damaged victim George had portrayed, but the strong, brave, loving woman she had always been. Aurora's story wouldn't end with her death. It would live on in every woman who escaped an abusive relationship with the help of her scholarship, in every person who learned to recognize the signs of manipulation and control, in every father who realized it was never too late to truly see and appreciate his daughter. George had tried to silence Aurora's voice, but in the end, it was his own confession that would ensure her story was heard. And in that irony, I found something that felt very much like peace. 6 months later, I stood at Aurora's graveside, no longer haunted by guilt and regret, but filled with understanding and purpose. The headstone, which George had chosen in his typical controlling fashion, bore only the basic facts of her birth and death. But I had added a small plaque beside it, engraved with Aurora's own words from her final journal entry. "If something happens to me, I need someone to know that it wasn't an accident." Now, someone did know. Everyone knew. And Aurora's voice, silenced too early by a predator's calculated cruelty, would continue speaking for years to come through the lives she would help save. George had lost everything: his freedom, his reputation, his ability to hurt anyone else. But more importantly, he had lost the power to control Aurora's narrative. The truth about who she really was and what she had died trying to do would be her lasting legacy, and that legacy would ensure that Aurora's love, courage, and strength lived on long after George himself was forgotten.